Okay.
Fucking.
All right, and we're live. Welcome to Varn Blog, and today I'm talking to Erika Whelan again, and we're doing a little follow-up on historical absurdities, overgeneralizations of modes of production, and why it's so hard to talk about the past when you're talking about it from a Marxist point of view, maybe. Although we might start off with today's most interesting bit of historical absurdity, since we were talking about people misapplying contemporary standards to the past. And today is St. Patrick's Day, and in honor of St. Patrick's Day, I remember you showing me a few takes where people were arguing that St. Patrick was leading a Romano-British settler colonial genocide against the indigenous peoples and religion of the Irish Isle.
That does seem to be what they were saying. The Romano-British colonial settler bit was not stated, but that did seem to be a pretty obvious subtext.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I found interesting was the conflation of religion as culture, and then this idea that there were no Christian Irish at the time in Proto Ireland, and I want to say Proto Ireland because it wasn't a unified
right
Ireland anyway. And B, I mean, I was laughing because I was like, you know that St. Patrick was, by all sources that we have, was a Romano-British Welsh person who was taken to Ireland as a slave, escaped, and then came back.
Right.
So,
I don't know where people get these things from. I mean, I can see where if you don't really know anything, the history of Christianity and the Catholic Church, and the colonization of foreign lands, especially in the early modern era, and I mean, frankly, even in the medieval period. I can see how people would think that it was, like it does make some sense if you view it in light of later actions by the church.
mm-hmm.
But this is not the same church.
Yeah, this is a barely unified proto-Orthodox church, really, a proto-Catholic church. There's no like. The papacy is not even really established with any sort of force at this time period. Yes, hagiographically it technically exists, but like the Roman bishop, the Pope is just the patriarch of Rome, and thus, yeah, it's funny because it's just a total misunderstanding of the way the religion worked, and it's reading 17th century context back into like the 4th century. Like,
yeah, 4th or 5th century.
Right.
I mean, we actually don't even know when St. Patrick actually lived.
Right.
The assumption has been that it was sometime in the early 5th century, and it's almost certain that he went there before the Anglo-Saxon settlement, that all of this happened before the Anglo-Saxon settlement.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think it would have to have been, considering what happened to the church after the Anglo-Saxons ended up settling. But, it's possible it was even like in the late 4th century. So, we're talking barely a century after this Council of Nicaea.
Right. I mean, there's barely a consensus, creedal Christianity. Like, so it's hilarious watching that being read through like a kind of 14th through 17th century view of the way European nations use Christianity, because I'm like, the Romans didn't even really care like that the Irish were Christian.
No, they didn't. I mean, the Romans never even got to Ireland.
Right. I mean, like it was, and this idea that, like, you know, Patrick was trying to wipe out like these native druids. We know nothing about the structure of Irish pagan priesthood in this time period. We don't know that the Gaulish druids are actually, you know, we know that they apply to the Romano-British, but they're kind of wiped out already by this point. Mm-hmm. But we don't know that they apply to the Gallic nations, the G Celts as opposed to the P Celts. For those who know your linguistic distinctions amongst Celtic.
Q Celts.
Yeah, Q Celts. Yeah.
Goidelic, or I forget what the other one, or insular versus continental. There's so many different ways people chop up the Celtic languages.
Basically, does it sound like Irish or does it sound like Welsh?
Basically.
Basically. With the weird exception of like the great Scotty versus Pictish stuff, it sounds like the Picts are a British Celtic group, and the Scotty are Irish pirates.
Oh, the Scots were originally Irish. That we know that for a fact.
Right.
Scotland, the Scots as we know them today, came over from Ireland.
Yeah, and genetically, the people who live in Scotland are descended from the people who would have been the Picts, the people who would have been the Scotty, the Irish settlers, and then the people who would have been the reasons why Scots and Irish people have so much red hair. Mm-hmm. Scandinavian invaders.
Yeah, okay, I know what you're talking. I know what you're referencing with that.
Because red hair apparently is not actually super common amongst. It's not a super common phenotype amongst Celtic peoples until they intermix with Scandinavians, mm-hmm. because red hair is kind of caused by inbreeding. So, just a thing. So it's one of those things when you know, you like me and you know just enough about historical forensic anthropology to like get yourself in real trouble when you start talking about phenotypes, because everyone, mm-hmm. But it's like, yeah, red hair, like there's like 3 different hollow groups that have it commonly, and it's a double recessive trait in humans, so you pretty much have to be pretty isolated for it to come up a lot. And the Scandinavians were super isolated.
That they were.
You know, in ancient times, I don't know why anyone ever lived there. Like, it's just like, it's a cold ocean. You can't grow anything. Like, all you can do is invade other people. Why would you?
Yeah. People live all kind of strange places.
Oh yeah.
I mean, you know, you have people living in the Arctic. So I mean, you know, like in not just in Scandinavia, but also across Europe, Asia, and even in the Americas.
Oh yeah. Yeah, there are indigenous tribes in, say, Wyoming. You know, I'm like, why?
Well, I was thinking the actual Arctic, like the Inuit.
True. But to some reason, actually, to me, in some ways, that makes more sense to me, because there's sea routes and stuff. Not that they would have even necessarily come over through sea. I mean, the Inuit did, because the Inuit are a later arrival set than
mm-hmm.
than the other indigenous peoples. But like, I mean, you know, because what is it? The oldest strains of indigenous people that have DNA more similar to Austro-Aborigines are in Central America. It's because like people came over by boat, like following the coastline, and went all the way down into, like, that's what the current genetic evidence indicates anyway. But like the Inuits are pretty late arrivals.
Yeah, no, that they definitely came later. That bit I wasn't aware of. I just, for some reason, that just sounded like, I don't know, it just sounded, the bit about the boats sounded like you were sort of like referencing Thor Heyerdahl for a second, but
no, this is yeah, this is more the whole why are some of the phenotype groups in Central America seemingly older than the phenotype groups of indigenous peoples in North America? Because that kind of makes sense, but doesn't. And it puts a lot of the genetic evidence puts a lot of strain on Bering Strait as the primary.
Right.
And who knew we'd be already all over this? Just talked about St. Patrick's Day, but it gets to like the way people misread the ancient world so badly when talking about even modern stuff. Like, and this gets to my mode of production thing. Like, I've been trying to figure out, like, okay, slave mode of production in Marxism. Now, Marx actually never outright like pins it down the way, say, like the Bolsheviks do when the Bolsheviks like have their historical schemas, and like this even like goes into Trotskyism. Like I was reading Ernst Mandel repeating this, like, you know, Rome is a Rome and the, you know, the early Islamic caliphates, and, you know, are either slave modes of production or Asiatic despotism, whatever that means. And
there's another favorite 19th century trope.
Right. And it's interesting. Like you and I was it you who was doing the translation of Marx, when Marx talks about like the primitive accumulation, and he means primitive because he's taking but he calls it so-called, even in what he means something about it, more like primal accumulation.
Yes. That was a couple years ago that came up, and I went back and looked at the original German for capital, and he calls it sogenannte ursprüngliche Kombination, which in ursprüngliche means original or primal.
And
now,
it is a translation of primitive from Adam Smith, but like,
right.
He also uses like basically the German version of so-called in front of it.
Actually, I believe primitive is actually a retranslation back into English of ursprüngliche.
Oh,
because in Adam Smith it's prior accumulation.
Man, Marxist translators have a lot to answer for.
That they do. Especially, oh God, what was his name? Abilene.
Mm-hmm.
That was I think a lot of the problems that Anglophone Marxism has in terms of its misconceptions of Marx come from Abilene.
Mm-hmm. Although there's also a lot of problems with the fact that like for example, imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, like you have double problems of imposing a German framework into a Russian context where the Russian phrase could mean either highest as in most developed or highest as in most recent, which is not even something we would even use highest for.
Right.
And then you have those people going back and reading Marx in English translations from the German, taking this weird translation from the Russian and then superimposing it on that.
Yeah.
It's people get mad. I mean, I remember Doug Lane getting mad at me when I told him to his face one day. Like this was one of the two reasons we didn't talk to each other for a year. Is I was like, if you read German, you would know how religious Hegel was. And if you don't read German, you can't pretend to like really know what he's talking about unless you read enough different English translations that deal with all the possibilities of his Swabian dialect interpretations, because you can't not interpret Hegel when you're translating him. And similar for Marx, actually, but it's not as bad.
Right. I mean, no matter what, the act of translation is an act of interpretation.
Right.
No, I mean, no two languages share the exact, same semantic structure, I guess, is the best way of putting it. Like every
even
language,
relatively close ones like English and German.
Yeah, and English and German. I mean, English is such a bastard language.
We're a pigeon language, man. Like,
I don't know about that.
Well, I think we wouldn't be anymore, but like Norman French plus Scandinavian, Old Norse plus Old English / Anglo-Saxon, which was mutually comprehensible with Old Norse.
Yes, it was.
Plus bits of everywhere the British have ever tried to take over. Plus like the fact that English has always been like, I don't know, we can have 85 words for things. Yes, this is probably a rap, but I'm going to call it a burrito over here and a swarmer over here because I just don't want to deal with it, and we can have infinite words. We'll just mispronounce everything. So, I mean, it's weird when you compare that to like French, where they're really weirdly conservative on outside influences on their language to the point of like absurdity.
Well, as James Nichol put it, the problem with defending the purity of the English language is that English is about as pure as a crib house whore. We don't just borrow words. On occasion, English has pursued other languages down alleyways to beat them unconscious and rifle their pockets for new vocabulary.
Yeah, I used to quote that at my college students and shock my Korean students when I read it to them, and I was like, because I'd be like, "What kind of language is English?" Like, it's related to Latin. It's technically a Germanic language, but with like a 60% Latinate vocabulary. But it's even a weird Germanic language at that. Yeah. So, plus, like, we gave up cases and genders and stuff forever ago because it was just too hard.
Yep. I mean, yeah, I don't know. The mutual intelligibility of Old English and Old Norse really kind of make it, because I think Old Frisian is also classified as a West Germanic language.
Yeah. And Old Frisian, if you speak modern Frisian to someone speaking Old English, it's pretty close to comprehensible to a modern Frisian speaker. And like all the 5 people who speak Frisian, but like they do exist. So
yeah, and modern Frisian is so those are West Germanic languages, which puts them in the same branch of the family as German,
right?
But they are almost like completely mutually intelligible with Old Norse, which is a North Germanic language. So, I mean, it sort of demonstrates how kind of arbitrary some of these classifications are.
Yeah, it is. And well, I was accidentally watching. I have my penchant for studying pre-Christian antiquity, and
okay,
my glasses aren't going on straight today. And I went to watch something on like the gods of the Anglo-Saxon invaders when they replaced Christianity before it came back. And of course, the guy was using sketchy. The people obsessed with this, other than me and anthropologists, are all usually pretty sketchy, like folkish pagan reconstructionist. Okay. And this guy is like a folkish pagan reconstructionist that I didn't realize until I like started picking up that he was using genetic studies in a weird way to say that, like, the Germans like literally completely genetically replaced the Romano-British who were in the area. And I was like, because there's like 80% new DNA strains, and I was like, that's an abuse of that research. Like I'm not a geneticist. I'm not even like technically a highly trained anthropologist, but I do know that just because you have new DNA doesn't mean you killed the people with the old DNA, because the old DNA is still there. Like the amount of people in Great Britain who have, quote, Celtic DNA, unquote, whatever that means, is is like something like 80% of the population, and they also about like 80% of the population has Anglo-Saxon DNA, because when people change cultures, it's a lot of times what you do is you change your religion, you change your name, and you might even have for a while 2 sets of names, and then and then the formal record, and then that's how it goes.
And then you over successive generations, you end up interbreeding, and the populations end up completely merging.
Right. I mean, like, think about like what happened to the Jutes. Like, why don't we ever mention the Jutes? Because they completely merged with the Angles, and so like even though like technically I think like
the Utes, okay,
yeah, the Jutes. You can make fun of my mispronunciation of everything.
I'm not making fun. I'm just like it because it sounds like you were saying Jews.
No, not the Jews.
I'm trying to figure out how we got to that.
Well, no, although I can talk about that because my own historical background and like tracing that down. So like Jewish DNA, and I'm like, what is Jewish DNA exactly? Like, because for example, both the Sephardic and like the Ashkenazi DNA strains, yes, there's some North African in there, but it's overwhelmingly Mediterranean, right? So it seems like a bunch of those people converted to Semitic. I mean, if you think about like the greater Semitic cultural sphere, that makes total sense. It was even merged like in ancient Jews were more likely to speak Greek or Aramaic, which were neither one their indigenous language, than they were to speak whatever Hebrew was before the Bible. So but yeah, it's a similar thing with them. So it's one of those things where like, well, the Khazar theory is anti-Semitic, and I'm like, I don't know. I mean, one, Arthur Koestler, who actually the first person to propose it, was a Jew himself. It got picked up by anti-Semites, and two, like, what happened to Khazaria? Like, you do have a kingdom of basically Turks who convert to Judaism and just kind of disappear. Did all their DNA just go away? Like
yeah.
I mean, like, it's just that all these people are trying to essentialize these very complex ancient worlds things, but when you get to like trying to figure out the mode of production of like the ancient Roman Empire, I can't even get a good number down from like the people who do economic history of Rome, where we have actually pretty decent numbers for an ancient world. Like, they kept decent records about how much of the population was actually enslaved. Because Rome, even more than Greece and Persia, was like constantly manumitting slaves. So they were like, people would be like, slavery was usually temporary in Rome. And wage labor was also kind of a thing, but it was mostly around the army, right? Like, I mean, literally, soldier means.
Yeah.
But there were auxiliaries who would get paid by the army because they were following them around, in coin too. So, or whatever was being used at the time. But by the time we're talking about Imperial Rome, you're using coins. Yeah, it's interesting to me when you start reading all these MMT people who have very good criticisms about like internal to a polity trade, but like ignore that like some kind of hard commodity currency was generally used between tribes and stuff, like at all times. David Graeber's good at this, but everybody else is like, oh, well, that doesn't have any implication at all. How not? You don't live in an autarky. But anyway, modes of production. So, do we buy that Marx thought that there was like 5 basic modes of production? What is it, the schema you're normally given? Primitive communism, Asiatic slave mode of society, Asiatic despotism, which are usually presented as the same.
Or at least parallel, if not
right.
necessarily the same. And then feudal, and then capitalism,
right.
basically.
And then when I've seen like people like Samir Amin, who, you know, his politics aside, I think does some interesting historical work, but try to fix the problem of like, well, it's really hard to tell how the manorial estates were not feudal in late antiquity when there was still slavery and this and the other. So we're just going to call this tributary mode of production. That just makes like everything between tribal society to capitalism the same thing. So, what do you think of like this idea that you like capitalism is the first, maybe properly speaking, pretty uniform mode of production, or do you think that's stating it too far?
No, I think that's I mean, I can't really see any way of impeaching that claim. Because I mean, the main thing is that before capitalism, nothing was nearly as integrated. You know, even the Roman Empire at its height was, you know, these ancient empires, even the Roman Empire, were. I think the Roman Empire was probably the most centralized polity the ancient world ever produced. But most ancient empires were basically agglomerations of territories that individual rulers had taken over and subjected to their personal rulership, and appointed people, usually locals, to run for them. And it was Rome did this to a large extent as well. Even though in a lot of ways, Rome, up until it was probably so. When we're talking about the empire, we kind of have to divide it into two different periods. Historians generally divide it into what they call the Principate and the Dominate. The Principate is what is, you know, the Augustus, the early empire up through like the end of the crisis of the 3rd century, which is more of a classical, you know, more of a classic ancient empire, like I was describing, where the empire exercised largely nominal overlordship over a large part of its territory, and generally relied on local elites to actually run things. They tended to become more or less Romanized and adopted a kind of Roman model of government, but you know, that was just because the Romans were on top, and everybody just sort of, you know, everybody just ends up emulating whatever the people who are running the show do. That's sort of how humans work. That's how human societies have worked for as long as there's been human society, you know, complex human societies like that, for as far as we can tell.
It's also not a one-way street either, because Roman Africa, for example, is pretty different than, say, the Near Eastern, the East, or what we would call the Eastern Roman Empire, and from the Western Roman Empire. Yet they're all distinctly pretty Roman. Like, but it's interesting because I think about it's not the same empire, but you think about the Hellenistic kingdoms, right? And how they're all pretty Hellenized, but also all the indigenous stuff kind of sneaks in, intermixes. Like I mean, the Hellenization of Bactria and Gajahara, I think I said that right, are, you know, the Silk Road empires around Afghanistan and Pakistan, like completely changes Buddhism, like, and a lot of and probably significantly alters Hinduism, to the point that like a lot of these people in the weirdo neo-pagan spaces I was talking about earlier, like they're always finding, oh, well, there's parallels between this and Hinduism, so we can use Hinduism to explain Greek religion. And I'm like, yeah, but you had Greek you had Hellenistic kingdoms and culturally Hindu, whatever that is, read it that far in the past, areas too, influencing in the opposite direction. So like, are you discovering a an ancient pan-Indo-European culture, or are you just like seeing a bunch of different invader societies mixing and creating hybrid things over and over again? But yeah.
So
but yeah, back to modes of production.
So back to obviously, yes, things have obviously there's influence in both ways. I mean, but my point was that sort of government structures tend to the governance structure, the way things got run, tended to end up adopting the Roman model across the empire. But then with the dominate, what ends up happening is this is to a large extent part of why the empire ended up falling apart is instead of allowing this kind of decentralized rulership, Rome starts to try to control things directly.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to maintain a government the size that they would need to be able to effectively administer a bureaucratic state on that scale, they had to increase taxes. And they had to start really standardizing things, and we start to see something that could have resembled a kind of early capitalism, really,
yeah,
in a lot of ways.
Generis Banerjee actually mentions that, like, if you look at late period dominate period empire and like early capitalism and the post Renaissance, they're really close. Like,
yeah. Of course, the problem is that the Romans lack the kind of mechanical engineering sophistication to produce the machines that they would need to be productive enough to maintain that.
Do you think that's from the fact that they were still dependent on so much human labor in the form of uncompensated labor, i.e. slavery and serfdom? Or do you think it's just because they weren't technologically advanced enough? I go back and forth.
I think it's some combination of both. Probably. I don't know. That sounds like a
how you would know.
That sounds like a wonderful PhD dissertation subject.
Right, but I don't know how you prove it either way, because like it's a weird feedback.
You can't. I mean, not only and I think our sources aren't adequate either.
Mm-hmm.
The Romans didn't keep the kinds of records we would need to be able to really have the data we would need to be able to really start to look at, assuming that it was possible to parse out the question, which, as you point out, is difficult. We just lack the sources. We lack the source material to adequately deal with it. Even if they did keep those records, they're gone.
Right. Well, I mean, we have a good idea of how much slave manumission, for example, was going on, which would indicate would indicate a whole lot of stuff that, like, it gives you like an idea of how their slave society was. To say like Greek slave society, which they didn't do that much slave manumission.
Mm-hmm.
But also the Greeks were never really thought of themselves as a unified polity until like they were invaded by the Macedonians. I mean, right. Or even like, for example, like the Doric Greeks, even before they speak a language that's comprehensible to the Ionic or Greeks, who may or may not be the relatives of the Mycenaean Greeks, and then my favorite thing is to point out that like modern Greece's claim to that heritage is actually a little sketchy in and of itself. Like that those peoples may not even be the same peoples who were in that area. Not that they would be wiped out either, but there's been so much Slavic and Ottoman and this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
that what does it even mean? I mean, I get into these things. Somebody was telling me the other day that they thought Chinese was the oldest written language, that currently exists. And I was like, Mandarin as it exists right now, not the writing system, but Mandarin, the language, Proto-Mandarin is still only 1,000 years old. Like, yes, there are languages in that language family going back 6,000-7,000 years, but like the version that we have, which even if you're a modern Mandarin speaker, you couldn't necessarily understand. And with Chinese, it's even harder to know how much you'd understand because they don't write things down all that syllabically. So, or even necessarily, this is what blew my mind when I realized how different the language structures of like the ideogrammatic, Chinese characters were. They don't even necessarily write things down in a way that is grammatic to the natural speaking grammar of the language that they're communicating in, which is why like you could have Chinese culture in Korea in a language that has a completely different language family background and a completely different grammar structure and tonal structure. Like, which is also when people talk about like Chinese, I'm like, what? Like even in China today, there's like 27 or 30 dialects that are barely mutually comprehensible, and some of them are not mutually comprehensible. Yeah. They're only called Chinese because they use the same writing system.
Yep. I mean, Mandarin and Cantonese are completely different languages.
Right. Even when I was,
that's not even getting into the ones with the smaller,
like Toisanese and
yeah.
When I was in Taiwan, there was 4 different dialects of Chinese there. Mandarin, something that I don't really know, another thing I don't really know, Taiwanese and Hakka. And those sounded completely different on the subway. Like the subway in Taiwan was crazy. It was like 9 languages. You get by the time they started saying it, and then they go through Korean, Japanese, and English, and you're just like, okay, but I'm like, hey, those first 4 languages are all dialects of Chinese, and now I don't speak Chinese, but they don't sound like the same language at all. Like, but yeah.
Well, I was like, for example, astonished because my father used to had at one point had told me that, like, for example, Vietnamese was a Sino-Tibetan language, and I was surprised when I started looking it up that it's actually not. It's Austroasiatic. It's classified as an Austroasiatic language.
It's like closer to like Malaysian or Thai, right?
I think Thai is actually.
I don't know. The Asian languages are one of the interesting that I learned about Asian languages is like, for example, like the Mongolic languages are my favorite is the Archaic language theory because everyone in Korea believes it, like no one else does.
Thai is actually in its own language family, Thai Kadai or Kradai, which completely separate from Austroasiatic or Sino-Tibetan. Like, and then no, I was thinking like Mon Khmer.
Yeah. Okay.
Which are Austroasiatic. It's closer to, like, in terms of its relationship to other languages, it would be the Mon Khmer, or Mon Khmer is a synonym, I guess, for Austroasiatic. So so like it's more closely related to Cambodian than it is to Chinese, even though it sounds much more like Chinese than Cambodian.
Yeah, that makes sense. And since it's been written in so many different scripts, it's like the Turkic languages. Like, how many different scripts has Turkish been written in? Like at least 3. Or the Mongolic languages, because there is a script for the Mongolic languages that predates their adoption of the Chinese.
Yep.
And now, like in Mongolic, it's written in like a mixture of Cyrillic and English characters almost. Like it's kind of strange.
They're reviving the old script though.
Oh, interesting. The very old script, like the weird spirally one.
Yes. The vertical one, yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting how much this, like, I'm always interested in like ancient Korean because, for example, very old language. Koreans also like to do that whole we're super old culture. We've been here for 6,000 years, even though we haven't been one culture this entire time. We've been like 5. Like my favorite bit of trivia about Korea is there's like when the West meets Korea, we can't pronounce its name. It's Gokoya, and we turn it in Korea somehow. But like there was literally 3 different states between what we call modern Korea and when we met them and gave them the name Korea from Gokoya. There's been like there's Choson, Great Han, and then modern. Like it's like those aren't even the same states. Like the only reason we think they kind of are is because we impose that wrong name on them. Like, and it's actually useful to the Korean like 20th century national mythology to go back and project that back. Kind of like the same kind of thing you saw in German. Like, you know, we're gonna have these Germanic peoples that are somehow unified culture, all the way back to the Alemanni, or even further back to like, I don't know. But when you look at like the Hallstatt culture, they're not a Germanic culture; they're a Celtic culture. It's like, it's like,
yeah, okay. So yeah, basically, the distinction between who got counted as a German and who got counted as a Celt was which side of the Rhine they lived on.
Yep.
If you lived on the left bank of the Rhine, you were a Celt. If you lived on the right bank of the Rhine, you were German. That's what Caesar said. That's all. That's where that all comes from. Caesar just said, "Okay, everybody living over here is a Celt. Everybody living over here is a German."
And we're not going to deal with weird ass hybrid cultures like the Franks, or the Normans for that matter.
I mean, the Franks. I mean, to be fair, they didn't come around until for another several hundred years. So
yeah, we think. Although the other thing is I've been doing a lot of research in these ancient cultures, and we're like, so is this a new culture or is this a culture, an old culture calling itself by a different name? We don't actually know.
Right.
Like, like are the Northern Thracians and the Dacians and like the Avars different people? Or are they the same people with different names? Some of these people seem like they're Persian fire worshippers. Were they always there? We don't know. Like,
yeah. Yeah, there's we literally like and the people who all of our sources, they didn't really care what they called themselves. Like that wasn't, they were whoever they said they were, not you know, the as far as the people who were writing our sources were concerned, those people were whoever, you know, the people writing the sources said they were. It didn't matter who. And, you know, I mean, obviously they're going to, you know, they're going to try and figure out obviously they're going to use their names on some level. They're going to use their names for them, or at least what they thought they called themselves. But, you know, it's all being interpreted through the cultural biases of the writers. And most of them weren't particularly concerned about the finer distinctions of ethnography that we're debating here.
Right. I mean, it's like trying to figure out if there was even like a quote Jewish people unquote in the like 4,000 years ago who were separate from the quote Canaanites unquote.
Right.
Like
probably not.
The Assyrians don't like. You have these. You do have evidence of some groups that eat pork and some groups that don't. But that's really like it. That's even when you study like the Elephantine Jews, they were clearly polytheist. So like, so what any criterion that we have about it doesn't apply. Even like the Persians and, you know, the Iranians and all that, like, were the Medes the separate people? Were they the same people? What we don't even know. We don't have a written form of their language. We don't know that Medic was actually, you know, what is it, a Proto-Iranian or Eastern Indo-European language? We don't actually know that. Like, because, you know, some of these cultures, or the Philistines, who we kind of know were probably a Greek culture related to the Minoans, but we only know that from grave burial items, which may have been traded. We don't actually know that. Yeah, like because the Philistines didn't write. Or they did.
I thought the Philistines. I could have sworn the Philistines were Semites.
The Philistines were related to Greeks and other Europeans.
Okay. All right.
But it is unclear if they spoke a. I'm looking this up because I was just reading about this and it blew my mind because I thought we knew that they were Semites too.
I mean, because Palestine is Philistia, so.
Yeah, but that seems to have come out of a Hellenistic tick. So that they named they gave the name of the Semites in the area the name of the Greek settlers who lived there. So that's Greater Philistia, and then gets shortened to Palestine.
Okay.
But I mean, as we were already saying, the great majority of Jews, like for example, just before the Roman Empire, they all spoke Greek anyway. Like, I mean, otherwise weird stuff like Philo of Alexandria doesn't make sense, where he's like, like Moses was the secret teacher of Plato because these word etymologies in Greek.
Okay.
Like, but yeah, and this is why like I actually don't, when I bring it up as a joke, but I sometimes like point out that like, hey, Marx and Engels were super scientific, but Engels believed in Lemuria because like pretty much most educated people did.
Right.
Like, so
okay. So yeah, I think so. That is definitely a hypothesis, but I don't.
What's the hypothesis?
No, about the Philistines being Hellenic. I don't know.
Well, the thing is, we don't know if they were Hellenic just because they had some Greek DNA, or if they were Semitic speakers who had Greek DNA. Like, we don't know. Both things are possibly are both easily possible. Which is why, to bring it back to our whole things and modes of production and stuff, like when we try to speak authoritatively about the ancient world on this stuff, it's like the more we know about this, the more we know we can't really give a clear delineation on a lot of this stuff at all.
Right.
I was reading was it American Genocides? It's a friend of mine looked at it, and it was like blaming the genocide of the indigenous peoples of America on like Roman ideas, which took it not that was like an 18th century appropriation of Roman ideas, but like that there was the actual Roman ideas. And I was like, the Romans, if they had a notion that we could see an analogous to race, it's based on religion and language, and skin color is totally incidental. Like,
yeah.
Because the Romans, the Germans were way less Roman than like the Libyan and the Berbers who had Romanized.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, honestly, like Romanization for the most part largely consisted of Christianizing and adopting Latin as your like lingua franca. I mean, even before that, even before the empire Christianized, it basically just consisted of accepting the divinity of the emperor, and
which ironically you didn't really have to do in Rome itself. But yeah.
And I mean, but if you and going back far enough, really, it just basically just meant accepting Latin as your lingua franca and basically just speaking Latin
Right.
And adopting Roman governmental forms is really what it came down to.
Right. And the Jews were only a problem because they were somewhat ticky on recognizing the emperor as, although usually early on in the Roman and even in the Principate period, they're just like, oh, that's still fine, whatever, just go be a weirdo over there, just pay your taxes,
right?
Like,
yep,
and don't revolt against us again,
yes,
or we'll disperse you.
Yes.
Which, of course,
the Romans really didn't care what you did as long as you paid your taxes and at least nominally acknowledged the divinity of the emperor. You were fine.
Well, someone's like taxes, tributes, really.
Well,
but,
tribute.
You were paying tribute, but was it? Where do we get the word tax from? I'm actually going to look that up.
That's a good question.
I don't know. I must go to the source of all knowledge. Let's see. Overview. What's the word origin, man? Computer.
From ultimately from Latin taxare in present active infinitive of taxo. Handle, censure, appraise, or compute.
So it literally originally meant like appraisal, to pay your appraisal fee.
Taxo is the active first person singular active present indicative conjugation. I feel, I touch sharply, I handle, I charge, I twit, I reproach, I censure,
I tax.
I rate, I appraise, I value, I estimate, I judge, I compute, I reckon, I estimate.
Oh, wow. So, like, it has a bunch of, like, it could mean everything from accounting to, like, I reckon that I tax that this is that far away.
Yeah.
This is why I love, like, Plato's, and, like, honestly, even sometimes sneaks into, like, Hegel and stuff, where you're just like, let's just make up an etymology because this word sounds like this word, and let's not deal with how hard this actually is.
Yeah, and the ancients did that a fair amount.
The ancients, the early modern Europeans did it a fair amount. Like, but yeah, like the Pennsylvania Dutch, that's my favorite. No, yeah, it's interesting to think about that. I think it's interesting also when you think about the early, like the transition from feudalism to capitalism, because one of the things that I think Trotskyists are the worst about, but like people influenced by Bolshevik, like, schemas of the early 20th century are all kind of bad about. Wow, yeah. Is really oversimplifying these relations and periods, and like saying like, okay, English Revolution, French Revolution, capitalism, and while I do buy into large parts of the Brenner thesis, is like it does seem like England's where you get the first fully developed thing that can be clearly labeled like agrarian capital into industrial capital.
Mm-hmm.
I do see like the counter arguments that like you have pretty capitalistic stuff going on, and like some of the monasteries, when their serf labor goes away after the plague, you got capitalistic relations emerging in the Byzantine city, in the Byzantine adjacent Italian city states, who are working as like third hand traders between the Silk Road people in Europe. Because they have them and the Templars kind of accidentally developed banking, but also banking had already existed. It's just they kind of reinvented it. It's very weird. Like, I'm always hesitant when I say, well, like, you know, X was invented in Italy. I'm like, yeah, but it also existed in this backwater over here in ancient China, because there's only so many ways to answer problems.
Yep.
Like, so it can, like, these things converge over and over again. And I guess in that sense, there is a sense of like a loose mode of production, but it's very, like we were talking about in our last thing when you were critiquing Collins, like you were saying, well, Collins seems to be completely right about Britain, but when you extrapolate that out to Germany and to
well, I mean, even Britain, he wasn't. I don't know that I would say he was completely right. He was. It was. He was. I would say that it was. His statement was definitely much more accurate about Britain than it was about basically anywhere else. But even in Britain, I think there was still some amount of. I'd have to. I'm on a little shaky ground there because I'm not as familiar with. I'm not really as familiar with the way land worked in Britain as I am with in Germany. But I mean, I would be surprised if there weren't some examples of land being sold. And even though I think even if land couldn't be technically sold, properly speaking, they had ways of getting around that. You know, you were mentioning the Templars. One of the sort of ways that people would get around, skirt a lot of restrictions on land transactions, is they would donate the money to they would nominally donate the money to the Templars, and then the Templars would give them something in exchange. So even though it was contractually the outward appearance was not of a sale, practically speaking, it kind of was.
Well, yeah, there's all these issues with de jure and de facto, and I mean, and MMT people are even someone like Colin, who is somehow like post MMT, post Marxist or whatever. But will tell you that like the de jure de facto blurrings are sometimes really hard to parse, and deliberately so. Like, is the Fed truly independent of the U.S. government? And when MMTers say stuff like that, I'm like, well, you kind of have a point, but
I think the answer is, for certain purposes in certain places at certain times, yes, and there's no. Like,
right.
It's one of those. Yeah, you kind of have to like.
The legal fiction matters.
For lack of a better term, you have to approach it dialectically.
Right. Well, yeah, it's funny because I was actually thinking about like one of their big things about like money is like legal fictions matter, and I'm like, right. Yeah, but you're also saying some legal fictions don't matter, and then I'm like, but it's really the case of like, I'm being vulgar in my explanation of some of my issues with MMTers, and a lot of them are not this dumb, so take that as it will. I think MMT is hampered down by its adherents on the internet who read Stephanie Kelton and think they've figured out a secret to fixing everything, and if we just did currency manipulation effectively and had a jobs guarantee, socialism. But
capitalists hate this one neat trick,
right? Which weirdly capitalists don't hate, because it also implies that they don't need to be taxed anymore except to limit their social power, and they can stop that.
It just, a lot of it, after a certain point, when you get too deep into this stuff, you start veering off into like sovereign citizen territory.
Yeah, although it's also like,
I'm not saying that MMT people are going to get there,
right?
Specifically sovereign citizen. I'm saying, like, if you start getting if
all
you
the like the technical,
yeah,
like this is a naval flag, therefore,
yeah,
like
exactly.
we're under naval law. I think, I mean, like I don't like when I read Kristen Dawson, I do see a lot of interesting things. Like I didn't really realize how much fiat currency was in the colonies because they didn't have access to the British crown all the time, and they would like literally just come up with complicated accounting systems and destroy certain amounts of currency to stop inflation from happening. And it kind of worked. But those same people also, I mean, the descendants of the same people also wanted a private money system for a long time.
Yep.
I mean, establishing the Fed was hard fought and took like 100 years almost. Like or maybe how long did it take? Maybe I think it did take more because Hamilton proposes it, but it doesn't actually happen.
Well, the Bank of the United States was, I mean, there was a central bank. The first Bank of the United States was set up in 1791. So we're talking, you're looking at almost the Fed was set up in the
but it 20s? Didn't have but the monopoly on currency doesn't really happen until what, the Civil War?
No, actually, well,
yeah, I don't know either. This is actually a part of American history I'm remarkably weak on because I'm like, Andrew Jackson didn't want a national bank that had the ability to unify the currency, and there's a lot of different bank scripts that were legal. And
I think there were. I mean, I technically, legally, the federal government has always had a monopoly on printing money, in a sense. Like,
right. Well, it's not
legally,
like
the Constitution.
Yeah.
Legally, the Constitution always reserved the power to print, mint coins and print money.
It was universally acceptable as legal tender for taxes.
Right.
But there was a lot of different script floating around legally.
For sure. No, but at the same time, like they didn't really try to enforce that monopoly. And I mean, even now, you arguably have, forms of private money floating around.
Right. Well, I mean, you have stuff like cryptocurrencies are interesting to me because they actually don't I keep on telling people and they get mad at me when I'm like, they don't really function like money because like, they have two of the, and I guess technically they have the ability to be traded on the public market, kind of, but they mostly function as an investment mechanism,
right?
And a kind of arbitrary one. Like you wouldn't want a currency that was as inherently deflationary, as Bitcoin, because it leads to what you have. Like,
I mean, it's crazy if you think about it. Like, you pay for something with Bitcoin and it costs, I don't know, just some arbitrary, let's say one Bitcoin, although like
one Bitcoin would be like $1 billion, though, right?
Like, but I'm just saying, like, but back in the day, one Bitcoin might have been worth maybe, I don't know. This is completely arbitrary, doesn't actually represent any reality. $1. Let's just, for the sake of argument, let's just say there was a point at which one Bitcoin represented $1.
There was that point at one point, like 15 years ago or something.
Right. So, and now you gave somebody one Bitcoin, and now if they still have that same Bitcoin, it's worth how much? It's way more than it was originally worth. Like, why would you, except for transactions that you kind of can't do with any other mechanism, and where you're going to get ripped off anyway, i.e. black market or gray market,
Why would you use it for anything other than securities? Because like it's a super good investment mechanism. It's an awful, actually, an actual potable traded currency because it would basically be hyper deflationary. It's like Zimbabwe in the 90s, but the opposite direction. Like, which is great if you're an investor, but terrible if you're trying to run an economy. And it was weird because I've met some people who were really into MMT, and they were also really into Bitcoin, and that's rare. Most MMTers are actually anti-Bitcoiners, but I have met them, and I'm like, but you're arguing that this is a currency because what again? And how do you still believe in MMT? Because you would know if you use this as a currency, if we adopted this as a social currency, as a private social currency, which we all use, this would make debts ungodly awful. Like, it would just collapse the economy almost within like a week. But
I think it wasn't until probably the I don't know. It was sometime in the late 19th or early 20th. I would say probably sometime in the early 20th century when federal money really. Maybe it was after the Civil War. Now that you mention it, but because it was part of the
unification of the country was like standardizing the script.
Yeah. Although even after the Civil War, I think there were still banks issuing their own currencies because you know what I'm going to go out on a limb and say it was probably like the 1870s to 1890s because
the end of the long depression.
Yeah.
I'm guessing that too because I'm also thinking like when also would Americans need to standardize it for international trade because we'd be doing so much more of it not through the British Empire, so we'd need our own stable.
Well, that and just the fact of so many banks having collapsed.
Yeah, well,
there weren't
bank collapses was like a fun part of the early phase of American capitalism. Like it seems like every other day it was just like, oh, no more bank. You guys thought that weird stuff you did with GameStop was bad, like
right. And it would have been interesting to see what would have happened if the feds hadn't stepped in and, for example, bailed out the savings and loans in the 80s and early 90s, and then the big investment banks in the aughts.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, interesting from an academic standpoint. I don't think I would want to have dealt with the consequences because that would have been really bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know. It's one of those things where when you hear people say, well, you should just let the banks collapse. And I'm like, well, that would have been fair. It would have actually hit all society equally, but it may have hit all society equally in a totally devastating, unrepairable manner.
Right.
Like, I don't have a good answer because part of me does get like, why are we always worried about moral hazard for small people, but all this big stuff, moral hazard never applies ever.
Right.
But
too big to fail.
Right. But then I'm also like, but in a real sense, they do get too big to fail. This is why Marxists warned about monopoly capital tendencies.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean they really were too big to fail. Like they literally, or Chrysler, like the federal government could not afford to let these companies go under. It would have pulled too many other companies with them.
No, yeah, it would have led to a massive.
Like it would have made the Great Depression look like a walk in the park. Like would have made the Great Depression look like a recession, probably.
I mean, it's interesting. I guess you could say that they could have done it if they had also immediately bailed out every person. But I'm like that
wasn't going to happen.
I was like, but that you're basically saying like, hey, United States government, let these big businesses fail, but also like pass a universal living wage and go total social democracy overnight. Like, and you know, with a totally decimated infrastructure that you have let go to crap where you probably couldn't do it anyway.
A friend of mine the other day was commenting about how the Republicans have been making all these inroads in northern Minnesota, and why all of these places that seem like they should be great places for the DFL to run socialist candidates, why are they not doing it? And I said, why? The DFL, if the DFL, which is the DFL is the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which is the Minnesota Democratic Party. Minnesota's a little weird. I think it's the only state where the Democratic Party is not the Democratic Party. It's the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, because there used to be a Farmer Labor Party, which was a kind of a social democratic party.
I was going to say the Farmer Labor Party was like a coalition between the populists and the socialists, and specifically in the Sewer Socialist Party of the United States, right?
Yes. And they ended up merging with the Democrats.
Good on them.
Right?
The DSA before the DSA.
Exactly.
Before the SPA got moved and merged with the Democrats under Shackman and Harrington the first time.
That was an interesting video, by the way.
The history of Harrington. I was shocked by the extent that Harrington came out of that Shackmanite tendency. As a side note, I watched a video by one of the IMT people who were trying to claim that like Max Chapman was never a trot, and I was like, people used to get the Cliffite tendency and the Shackmanite tendency mixed up because they were so close on state capitalism, like, and in fact, people like someone as radical as Hal Draper in the 30s was part of the Shackmanite tendency and moved over to the Cliffite tendency as Chapman moved right. Like, and then Draper does whatever Draper does, which eventually leads to the monthly review, which seemed like a good idea at the time, but
famous last words. So I said, well, you know, if the DFL, like, I think I said it's questionable whether the DFL has really ever run socialist candidates. And even allowing that it did, it will never do so again. You know, our ruling class has spent the past century plus struggling against socialism. They won, or so they think. Like, they won. They won the Cold War 20 years ago. They're not about to let socialists into the halls of power.
Right, and I was about to say, like, the whole post-war FDR compromise that a lot of DSAers, even like Marxist-y ones, like, are like, yeah, that's the foundation of our movement or whatever. I'm like, that was the death of your movement. Like I've been reading Christopher Lasch, and he was like, yeah, the progressives aim to co-opt and neutralize the populists and the socialists from like moment one.
Right.
But also, like, that also happens in the context of both World War II and the post-war, you know, America has all the wealth because we didn't get bombed, except in Pearl Harbor, kind of. And,
well, I mean, literally all they did was sink a bunch of ships.
Right. Like, it killed people, but it didn't destroy any productive capacity. And also in the fact that, like, people were still scared before basically before 1936 that the Soviet Union really was an alternate way of life that could take out Western capitalism, particularly after, you know, stuff like the Long Depression, which we have forgotten, but they sure as hell had not. So it's just interesting that people are like, yeah, we can do it. I'm like, why would they do that? What I'm just use some capitalist game theory, my friend, and figure out why would they. There's no external. China's not going to force them to be socialist. China's
right.
Integrated into the. No matter what you think China is, it's totally integrated into the world capitalist circuit. Like, what do you want? Like, what counter pressure is out there? The internal workers movement. Okay, yeah, but it's like the organized form of that is what, 17% of the population on a good day. If you believe that everybody who's in a union is part of the organized labor movement, which is kind of a stretch.
Yeah.
You know, my union here is pretty much a Republican subsidiary, because if you're not, you don't get anything done. But so yeah, it's, I don't know.
I mean, you know, what I was like, well, you know, what's good for them is good for America. I mean, after all, didn't they create America for their own benefit?
Yeah. I mean,
like the whole history of this country has been about, you know, the nascent bourgeoisie being able to, you know, extract more profit from commerce. You know, that was the motivation for the New England, you know, the northern colonies in the American Revolution was about getting rid of the taxes that England was imposing, so that they could trade more freely and keep more of the money that they made in trading. And then when, you know, when the United States started to industrialize, they created these protective tariffs, and that's, you know, like that was what a large part of the underlying antagonism between the North and the South that led to the Civil War, was the question of tariffs. And the South seceded because they'd lost control of the Senate. They'd lost control of the House. They'd already lost control of the House. And then in the 1860 election, they not only do they lose the White House to what they think is a radical abolitionist, but they also lose the Senate, which means they are not going to be able to prevent anything Lincoln wants to do.
Mm-hmm.
So what's left to them, because their whole way of life, based on the exploitation of slave labor, is now in mortal danger. I mean, and it really was.
Well, I tell people, like, to understand the Civil War, you have to drop, even though there is an anti-slavery narrative that's part of it, although its centrality to the Civil War is literally 2 years into the actual war as far as the North is concerned. Well, now, that's not true on the South. I mean,
I think it's central, but not in the way a lot of people think about it.
Lincoln wanted to stop the expansion of the slave trade.
Right. As slavery. Trade was already, the international slave trade was already illegal.
No, but not in terms of the territories. That's what caused it. Lincoln did not want to legalize slavery.
But what I'm saying, no,
illegally slavery.
In the United States, it was already illegal to trade slaves internationally.
Right. It was the question. The question was like
the expansion of slavery
into the territories.
Not the slave trade per se.
Right.
Slavery.
Actually,
agriculture.
I was talking to someone last night about the irony of limiting the importation of slaves. Actually, made the slavery the conditions of slaves in the United States worse.
Yeah.
Which is something people, which I'm not saying it was, it wasn't better for the world history for us to do that when we did it, because a lot of people died in the transatlantic slave trade. It was basically, more or less a genocide, but like the conditions of slaves on the ground, and it being more essentially racialized because of the limits of stocks, and then like leading to more cells of families and all that, really kicks up after the international slave trade, the U.S. participation in the international slave trade is banned,
and that's when a lot of the eugenic stuff, like what leads to eugenics, starts then too, because since they can't import large numbers of slaves anymore, they have to start breeding them.
And that's as gross as it seems like. Yeah.
Yep. I mean, you know, I not to say that some of that wasn't already around. Obviously, like nothing just completely starts overnight, but that's when it really starts to become a preoccupation of the planter class is the breeding of slaves, because now they have to rely entirely on the population of slaves that are already present to produce new slaves.
Right. And it actually incentivizes miscegenational rape, which is it's bad. It's bad. It's always common in slavery, but it from everything that I can tell, it actually gets worse after the whole focus on breeding slaves becomes a thing. Like it's so yeah. But you know, I think Lincoln had a longue durée hope to end slavery, but he thought he could do it without making it illegal. But and in a way, the Southerners realized he could, because if they made the expansion of the slaver franchise, the expansion of slavery into the territories illegal, slavery was no longer profitable enough for the planter class to really compete against the industrializing Northeast.
And you know, if you look at it, slave agriculture was really hard on the soil, especially.
Oh yeah, Georgia's like ruined its soil, destroyed its forest land. Like all the forests in Georgia that we have, except for the ones in the mountains and on the Barrier Islands, are all actually imported pines that are not indigenous to the area, because they stripped all that for the plantations. And like, oh, that's why kudzu's there. Like that's why that's why the Japanese beetle's there. Like they were just like, we got to do anything to save the soil. Let's bring this super focused stuff from Asia. Oh, the soil's richer here. Oh crap, it just took over. Like,
yep.
It's basically one agricultural like invasive species tragedy after another to recoup how bad they screwed up the land. And they didn't totally fix it immediately either. I mean, after slavery, because sharecropping was still a thing for another almost 100 years.
They were still growing the same crops.
My family, like my granddad's parents were the ones that were here in the States going all the way back, because I have some that have been here since the 1600s and some that are basically late 19th century immigrants. But like they were sharecroppers until like the 1910s, and then they went into textile mill work, which was the only in Georgia, like the only major industry that was in the South, which is also, by the way, textile mills historically have always been where you put them in the poorest, shittiest parts of the country, and then when those parts get better, you move it to another country. Like, but that's how textile mills has historically worked.
Didn't Kyle and Shane talk about that at one point on GIU?
Yeah.
They talked about how like capitalism will they'll go in and they'll, you know, it takes the shitty place because people are desperate enough to go to work, and then once it's no longer completely shitty, or no, it's not that they take it. I think it was the opposite. It's like they would move in somewhere, and it wasn't like crap, but it also like, you know, they needed to find somewhere where people were desperate enough to actually go to work in their mills, and then once it got to the point where people were no longer willing to put up with the terrible conditions, it
moves on. I mean, people think that's like a thing of the 80s and like a new thing that like, oh, neoliberal capitalism introduced with outsourcing. No, that's always been part of the thing. And also, like, I've always been amused that people who really buy into like core periphery status have never like applied it within capitalist nations in a way that would like there's cores and peripheries within the like.
Oh, absolutely.
The liberal coasts really are an imperial core within the imperial core. Like, and they kind of have been for 200 years. Like, so like when you're trying to, as a good Marxist, and you're trying to understand like, why do all these people in these areas that are more working class, why are they backwards? And I'm like, yeah, because the progressive stuff is represented by someone who even if people don't phrase it in this way, they see as sucking their value out of their area. Like, yeah. Now it seems like our Emancipation Network friends have invaded the Varn blog like the Welsh invaded Ireland, according to the blog post we talked about at the beginning and St. Patrick's Day. So we might have to fight off our colonial oppressors, but good old who happen to be ironically a mixture of Americans and Irish, but I think there's some Turks in here too, actually, but it's to kind of round it off. Yeah, it's interesting when we talk about how much people don't know about ancient history, but I'm actually often floored by how much they don't know about recent history, like I don't think many people understand the developmental patterns of the United States before 1960. Like basically for a reason that I don't know, may have to do with the interwar boom and social pact. Like Americans seem to think the world began with the generation right before the boomers, and all history prior to that is just forgotten about, except for the Civil War and the American Revolution.
Yeah.
But basically, there was the bad slavery period. There was the end of the bad slavery period, which we don't know anything about. I guess stuff happened economically. I've never heard of the Long Depression. What are you talking about? Then there is the Great Depression, which FDR supposedly magically fixed with Keynesian magic, even though Keynes hadn't written the general theory yet. And also, I love when people attribute to the New Deal all these Great Society programs. Do you know what I mean? Have you ever noticed that?
Notice what specifically? Sorry.
When people attribute to the New Deal all these Great Society, Lyndon Johnson era anti-poverty programs and stuff, it's like public housing wasn't really part of the New Deal, guys.
No, it definitely wasn't. No, it wasn't at all. I mean, the New Deal really was mostly, I guess, the WPA and the Civilian Conservation Corps, and then the National Recovery Act,
right?
Which literally was just pumping money into businesses to get them to
hire people.
Yeah.
And I guess it's also the Farm Bill, and which.
Oh yeah, okay, the Farm Bill.
Yeah.
I mean,
But the Farm Bill originally was just purchasing a bunch of wheat or a bunch of corn so that it didn't depress just to prop up the price artificially. Which, as a side note, I hate to say, but the weird Michael Pollan people and the libertarians are right. Help make America super fat.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that is definitely
because corn sugar became real cheap to make.
Yep.
But yeah, it's some of the thing. And shut up before I mention this. Somebody was like, "I'm really a Kurd. I'm sorry for confusing you with a Turk. Please forgive me." And
I actually didn't realize we were live, so I haven't been paying attention to the chat. So Grimlock mentions the TVA. Yeah, the TVA was also part of the New Deal.
Yeah.
Rural electrification, that was another thing.
Yeah.
And then earlier there was a question about the Persian influence in the Islamic Golden Age.
There's a bunch
I can't answer that. That's not really my area of I don't really have enough knowledge about that.
The
To really
Islamic
be able
Golden
to answer
Age,
that confidently.
in my understanding, benefits greatly from its absorption of large parts of the Greek Roman Empire and its absorption of large parts of the Persianate world. And I'm gonna use the Persianate world because there's a bunch of different empires that it was. So yeah, it builds up real fast. So there's a kind of I was talking to someone about this morning, and it was like, if you really think like the ancient Greeks are the West and you don't believe the weird German rewriting of history that happens in the 18th century about the ancient Greeks, you have to admit that like the Islamicate world is a product of the Persian and Greek world as much as it is anything that comes out of the Semitic world. Like,
and interesting fact. I just discovered this the other day. Well, not the other day, but I was having a conversation with someone about Rome, and someone mentioned about like how a bunch of different Roman emperors were from, I think they said they were from North Africa, and I did some looking, and I couldn't find any actual legitimate emperors from North Africa, but I did figure out that Elagabalus was I think that's, I'm probably mispronouncing that, but you know what I'm talking about. Was Arab.
Yeah, Elagabalus was Arab, and he was actually accused of worshiping some weird, like
the deity that he was named after, because he descended from a family of essentially priest kings who married into the I think the Severan dynasty.
Right. I think a lot of the I will say, by the time you get to the Dominate period, a lot of the emperors are not Italic anymore, but they're not usually not North African. They seem to like mostly be either Levantine or
most actually, strangely enough, you got there were a bunch from the Balkans.
Yeah. I was about to say there's a bunch of like Thracian emperors went there. Yeah. So we are all over the place in time. This is some timey-wimey bullshit here. We were just talking about the Tennessee Valley Authority, and now we're talking about like high period, dominate period Roman Empire. And somebody said something, I think, just to get under your skin, Erika. The electrification of the Tennessee Valley is actually existing socialism.
I saw that. How droll.
Yeah, it's funny. I always, one of the things that I will say that kind of freaks people out, but that a lot of these FDR people, because a lot of them are at heart, they're really liberal Bonapartists who want a myth. A lot of them actually are remarkably soft towards Stalin. And I'm like, I wonder why that is, because you're liberal Bonapartists that want a myth. And because the difference between Stalinist bourgeoisification and Stalin bourgeoisification is just how brutal and how centralized you want to be about it. Like, but, and not to say that isn't important. Like, I would have I don't know though. I do wonder. Would I rather live in China than India? Probably rather live in China. If you survived, the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Okay.
No, I'm just thinking about it because, like, the kind of rapid bourgeoisification project, as opposed to what India did. India's model was we don't have the cultural overhead to invest in rapid, in the late stage bourgeoisification, or what we would call modern industrialization or whatever. So we're going to do really good education programs because that's cheaper than industrial social development. But what that leads to in India is just constant, massive brain drain.
Okay.
And so it actually doesn't lead to a development of productive capacity in India, and like that's why India is like got parts that are so underdeveloped even compared to its own cities.
That makes sense.
Whereas China has more parts that are undeveloped than people realize because like it's hidden by the internal passport system, but it's still way better than what India did. But yeah, like if I was comparing China today to China to India today, yes, of course, I would probably pick China. Although I would also probably not pick either. If I really wanted to have my way, I'd have been born in like some obscure Latin American country that was rich enough to be left alone, but poor enough to be left alone. Like Argentina, maybe. Like
even Argentina wasn't actually left alone, though.
I know. You don't actually get left alone.
I'm like, that sounds like that's a thing.
No, it's not a thing. I mean, arguably Mexico is only tangentially messed with after the Mexican-American War.
I guess that's fair.
But that's still a bit arguably. That's ignoring the whole like, well, Europe tried to reinstall a Habsburg here,
right?
Like, and got away with it for 10 years. India is the imperial Russia of today. China, the imperial Germany. Actually, that actually is a good analogy.
Yeah, that is actually a really good analogy.
How I used to say, like, Korea is the France of East Asia, and China is the Germany. I mean, not the China. Korea is the France of East Asia, and Japan is the Germany, and China is the America. Like
that works.
Yeah, but that's even better that Nico did there. So to sum up our conversations today, St. Patrick, probably a genocidal oppressor. Modes of production, we can totes find them in the ancient world in a clear way. Let's see what else.
FDR was totally a socialist, and the United States is a workers' paradise.
Yeah, FDR was totally a socialist, and the United States is a workers' paradise until the evil Reagan, evilly and twirling his non-existent mustache, came and destroyed it all through his act of will and not any economic will whatsoever. And the Tennessee Valley Authority is actually existing socialism. Yeah, feel free, internet, to insert that and put that out there as my actual opinion. It's like the time that someone took me out of context when I said that the John Birchers weren't totally insane, that the FDR administration was full of communists.
I mean, they weren't.
I was like, they became insane later. Or they were always insane, but they happened to be accidentally right.
Yes. The Birchites are a really interesting bunch. They aren't completely insane.
They're just mostly insane, but like all good insane things that can actually stick, there is out of every 100 insane things, they actually hit upon something true but denied by the popular culture.
Yep.
Which is
and actually the whole thing with the TVA and everything and the New Deal, like the realization that this what the purpose of those programs were kind of actually got me into Kevin Carson for a while. I mean, I was reading Kevin Carson before he hooked up with C4SS.
Yeah,
back when he still had his blogger blog.
So my relationship to that world's actually interesting, because Kevin Carson for me was also one of my transition figures out of paleoconservatism. Through I was never an anarchist, but I would like play around like this with like the mutualist people, and then I was like, your economics don't make sense.
Yeah,
I'm going to study the actual history of economics, and I end up like, okay, Keynesianism sort of makes sense until it doesn't. Marxism doesn't have a positive economics that I can really lump onto, but it definitely has a negative one. And yeah, someone's like Uruguay. Uruguay are like Costa Rica. Those are okay countries to be born in. Like,
I don't know about that. Costa Rica has death squads.
That's true.
And yes, they did believe that. I don't know about a communist or Russian spy specifically. I mean, I guess spy in some sense. Like they thought he was a Russian asset.
Yeah, they thought he was a Russian agent. So,
in reference to Ender asked, didn't they believe that Eisenhower was a Russian spy?
No, they thought that he was a Russian plant. Like,
yeah,
Eisenhower to Russia was Joe Biden to Chi-Coms by Alex Jones, and Alex Jones is like a second generation. He's like what the Birchers turned into, but the Bircher conspiracies are weird. The other thing that was weird about the Birchers is they had a attitude: we can't defeat these evil communist conspiracy Leninist cells unless we become evil communist conspiracy Leninist cells for planting conspiracies and fighting communism. So we're Leninists for freedom, which seriously, like, the founder of the Birchers explicitly based their internal cell structure on war communist cells. So
didn't Chomsky? Didn't Chomsky accuse the Republicans of being a Leninist party?
Yeah. Oh, I actually said I've even said that at one point. I was like, in some ways, the Republicans understand democratic centralism because they're highly divided and fractious party, but they know how to like line up behind their whatever Bonaparte they're feeling like at that time, even though like ideologically, like the right in America is even more fragmented and weird than the left. It's just they're not principled enough to be as a-principled as we are. What do you guys think about Moss? I don't know enough about it, actually.
Yeah, same. I mean, I can only give sort of, surface, like it's another bourgeois political movement, really. I mean, ultimately, like beyond that, I don't know enough about it to really speak about it and with any at all. Like I can't say anything about it beyond just saying like the fact of it being in power in a bourgeois state makes it a bourgeois movement. And Moss is Morales, right?
Moss, see Lanera. No.
No?
Yes.
What am I thinking of?
Yes, it is. Yes,
okay, that's what I thought. Yeah. Probably I'm gonna say probably not generalizable because of the indigenous component.
Right. I think the decolonization thing, like from my standpoint, it would be like I might even say like it's a quasi bourgeois formation, but it might be one worth supporting for reasons of it, indigenous autonomy in Latin America. But like it would be like, and this is a difference between Erika and I, as Erika is more absolutist on these things, and I'm always like, well, I agree with you, Erika, but like strategically, maybe we could temporarily do something like those Trots did that one time, where we like say we don't really support it, but actually support it with 55 caveats. Wait, oh no, I just contradicted myself. Never mind, I'm gonna shut up. But that's sort of where I would say I'm interested in it, and I'm not gonna crap on it because I don't know enough about it. I do know a little bit about the situation in Bolivia with Morales and how, I do think it's a little ridiculous that everybody in America assumes that America always sets up the right-wing coups. The right-wing coups just can't happen in other countries on their own. It's not like the right wing is rich or anything everywhere else either. I do think that there's some interesting stuff going on there, but I also wonder what its natural limit is, since the indigenous component probably does limit its ability to even link up completely with other groups in Latin America. And so it's a little hard to see where it's going to go. But I'm talking kind of out my ass because I only started following it a little bit as this whole, as the Lanera stuff started bubbling up recently, and so I was making sure I had it in my head right. At least you didn't ask me what my opinion was of like the FARC and wanted me to give a positive appraisal of that.
I mean, to be clear, I'm not necessarily
no, you're not
on them.
No, I'm not saying you are actually.
I'm just just my particular political work. I just my political orientation and the political work that I do just doesn't involve working with them or really like I mean, to the extent that I'm even doing anything, was my actual activity has dropped off in the past couple of months because I've been working third shift and, doing IT certification prep program in the morning. So like, I get home, I do class, I go to sleep, I go to work. So I haven't had a lot of time to really do a lot of the work that I've been supposed to do. But even before that, it was mostly, I mean, it's not that I think that they're like necessarily bad per se. It's just
it's within a bourgeois state and a bourgeois context, and within your particular formation, and with your particular classical form of formation, unlike more modern forms of your formation, you do not like inherently think that national liberation in a bourgeois context is bad. There are people who share a figure. Not
abstractly. We don't really see any place for it now, just because of the historical circumstances that we're in. It hasn't really been viable since the 50s. Maybe I don't personally see it. I don't think anybody else sees it, but maybe there might be something there again at some point. But it's that. Realistically, though, I think a lot of this is just
our opinions on this don't matter.
I mean, they don't, and I think also the viability of those kinds of things is just a signal again of the weakness of the workers' movement and of communism, like of the communist movement. It's just.
Yeah, I think the difference between Erika is you would be more skeptical and I would be skeptical but supportive, and you would be skeptical and just like totally like it's just not relevant at all.
Yeah,
like this is someone else's problem.
Like, basically.
Yeah. And we're not explicitly stating anyone's political. I mean, I'm a Varnist, so and even I doubt my Varnism is pure enough. So it's
self-crit struggle session.
What's that stupid meme? The whole like I am dialectical enough to call me of yesterday a coward and a fool. Like which I don't think that's how dialectics actually works. I think that's borderline schizophrenia, but like whatever.
Or maybe you could be a Grouchoist.
Ah, yes.
You wouldn't join any club. Or no, is that no? Actually, my bad. I don't think
that's a Harpoist, isn't it? It's one of the Marx brothers.
I suddenly for some reason thought it was Sam Clemens, but
that may be where they stole it from. Let's see.
Maybe
not join any club that would have me. The source of all knowledge says Groucho Marx, but let's see if it's actually got, because often these are actually misattributed.
They'll tell you who
somebody says it's attributed to Woody Allen, and I'm like, nope, that's definitely quoting Groucho or Mark Twain. It's like, my favorite thing about this, and I've even quoted this, that whole Lenin quote that Lenin quote in quotation marks. Where what's it that there are weeks where there are days that go by like years, and then what's that one?
I think I know what you're.
Yeah. So I looked up the origin of that quote because I'm like, wait, I can't find that in Lenin anywhere, but it's always attributed to him.
weeks where decades happen.
Yeah, there are days when decades happen. Yeah, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. Violent Ehrlich's Lenin. Okay, here's the thing on that quote. I went through the collected Lenin available in English. I can't find it. And so I started looking for the origins, and the earliest it's quoted in English that anyone can find is by George Galloway in the 90s.
Really?
Implying that he just made up a Lenin quote for a speech.
That sounds like something Galloway would do.
Right.
Galloway,
yeah. But it's been repeated so often that you look it up and it's always attributed to him. But like, no one ever says what work it's in. And then like, I'm like, where's the first instantiation of this phrase in English? And it's a Galloway speech. And I was like, you made up Lenin quotes. I mean, he wouldn't be the only person to do it. Like,
right. Well, there's a
all those made up stuff in Settlers, for example, where Jay Sakai's like, Engels and Lenin believe this, and like doesn't cite it, can't find it. You can look through the collected works, and it doesn't seem to exist. Like,
and then there's a famous Lenin quote that's frequently attributed to Marx.
Oh well, yeah. There's a lot of Lenin quotes that are frequently attributed to Marx.
The oppressed are allowed once every few years to elect which member of the oppressing classes to represent and repress them in Parliament. I mean, it's Lenin was riffing on something Marx actually said, but
it's not
Marx never actually said that.
Yeah, it's like when I tried to find out where Marx said the word false consciousness for a video that I did this week, and I'm like, he never used that term ever. Engels used it once in a letter, like as an offhand explanation to try to explain why there were some conservative British workers, and he was like, I don't know, labor aristocracy and false consciousness or something. And I mean, it was slightly more worked out than that, but it was a private letter, and like everybody picks up that letter to be like, see, Lenin says we need the party because of false consciousness, because the workers will never. I'm just like, oh God, and Marx says that too, and I'm like, where? Like, he doesn't even use a phrase. Like, he uses class consciousness a few times, but most of the time the German is actually class for itself and class in itself. Like, it's not like sometimes that gets translated as class consciousness. Now someone's manufacturing the Lenin quote in Spanish. A quotation that belongs to who needs it, not its writer. I love that
twin quote.
Oh, we couldn't figure out if the Groucho Marx quote was a misattributed Twain quote. Love that song about breaking America's spirit that the conservatives like to pull out of their ass. Yeah, what's the one that they attribute to about ruining the banking that they attribute to Stalin? It's totally made up.
They just make shit up all the time. I mean, literally, they will literally just manufacture something and insist to their dying breath that you actually said it. And it's like, and people will believe them. Oh, no, Grimlock was talking about something else.
Oh, there's one that came from his biographer. Yeah, quotations, unless it's modern and you heard it on YouTube and it wasn't a deep fake, you can assume probably are made up. unless you have, like, particularly if it's a quotation that is not in a specific text that we have a textual reception for. You know, like you know, with the MAGA and not the MAGA, with the Mega and the various different Marx Engels archives. There's like 3. We have a pretty
good Mega, and what's the other one?
It's the Mega something. It's the Mega G, right? Like the new one.
The Mega 2.
Yeah, the Mega 2. Yeah, which has got that one's got.
Mega 2 was just an extension. I thought Mega 2 was just an extension, a continuation of Mega 1.
I think maybe it is, but the Mega it goes. One of the things I was reading in the Marcelo Mosto work, which he pulls from the Mega, is how much of the MECW didn't have the English language only works, because apparently there's a lot of English language only Marx stuff, which is weird because Marx's English wasn't terribly good, but he did write a lot of stuff that apparently all we have of it in any copy is in English because it was translated immediately for like newspapers and shit. So,
I guess okay. I guess Mega 2 was not an continuation of Mega 1. It's something completely new. Okay. Well, I mean, I guess not completely new, but it's a revival of the original Mega, which was never completed. Yeah, it was never completed. Because the Ryazanov was killed in a show trial in 1938.
But it's interesting because a lot of the early Frankfurt School work, when they were still doing Marxological work, they had access to the Mega 1 and the and the MECW, and they were trying to use that to figure out, the relationship of Marx and Hegelianism. And Pollock, when he went to Russia, actually met with Rezanov to start getting better translations of stuff, and then he gets liquidated, and everybody gets kicked out of Germany. Who's all the Jews leave. So
right. That's okay. That's the other one. Marx Engels Werke.
Yeah. Why can't there be just one good archive? Why can't I base my Marxist theory written on the back of a napkin that Marx did once? That I bring that up because I think about like Nagiri basing so much of his philosophy on an expansion of a subsection of Capital Volume 1, the subsection that's taken out of Capital, not by Engels, but by Marx himself. Like, yay. A central planning for Marxology, please.
Yes. The Marxology cause plan.
You know what's maddening is every time I get a book on like Marxism and I read it, and like even when it's someone who like a Trotskyist scholar I respect, like Ernst Mandel, and it's like Marx thought this thing that I'm quoting Trotsky and Lenin about, and I have no Marx quote whatsoever for, and no textual evidence for this, but because it's part of my tradition of Marxism, I'm going to assert it as what Marx thought. And even good people in the mid-20th century did that shit. It's really frustrating. No wonder no one knows what Marx thought. Like, it's like, but like, for example, I'll give you an example from Jay Sakai because I'm picking on Jay Sakai right now. Jay Sakai was like in the first draft of the Communist Manifesto, there was this subnote, about proletariat. And I used to repeat that to people believing it. And then I went back through the archival documents of the manifesto and the Communist Catechism. And what Sakai is doing is he's taking a draft for the Communist Catechism and like assuming that was the first draft of the manifesto, and then saying that it was a footnote written by Marx when it's a subcategory written by Engels that they dropped because they decided that you shouldn't axiomatically define shit. Oh yeah, Mandelbrain, when you assert comparative time according to feudal Japan with no citation. Yeah. Cockshot, run it through the computer. How dare you? Don't mention shaft blast in my presence. Oh man. You can tell Marxists have like not spent enough time studying math when linear algebra impresses them that much. Right. Don't anyone ever give them a book of econometrics, they'll just like give up on socialism.
Head explode. I mean, isn't that pretty much what happened with Cockshot?
Yeah. I like Mendel.
He discovered econometrics, and
He discovered econometrics and then was like, what if labor tokens was like currency, but not? And what if we take this late Stalinist assertion that like you're never going to get rid of the law of value because Stalin gave up on it, and just like assume that that's true? Then we can do computers. We can have God's plan without the bureaucracy, just with the coders. God's plan with the coders. I remember taking literal.
Nobody tell Cockshot about AI.
Oh no! Keep Marxism pure. No math allowed. I mean, look, we're Emancipation Network, with the exception of me, who is more into the historical anthropological sciences, is mostly like a bunch of engineering nerds. But Schafblad did high school stats and fooled the avant communizers about Schafferins with LTV. Cockshot's labor tokens idea wasn't that bad as an accounting. I actually know this person's a structuralist, so we'll just leave it at that. I'm going to talk to them next week. So I'll argue with them on that day. Luckily, through Zooms, I can't punch anyone. So,
yeah, STEM kids are going to kill us all. One in particular. No, MOA, we do not like Cockshot.
Are we Cockshot? No, we're not Cockshot stands. I was being sarcastic about, like, I knew a lot of people who were really impressed by Cockshot because they hadn't read I think they hadn't read a Marxist text that had actual math in it, since they hadn't read any Marxist texts that predate 1975, when apparently all the engineers gave up and left Marx alone. Doesn't GIK advocate labor? A lot of people advocate labor chips because Marx advocates labor chips.
Sorry, Ezra, you're right. It's Shaft Blaster.
Yeah, it's true name. Oh no.
Uh-oh.
Am I here?
No. That was a joke. Oh, now I can't hear you. I can't hear you. Can't hear you, Derek.
Okay, so I'm going to read this. I think what people piss about towards the news, towards new socialism, including Cockshot himself, is that it's a utopian vision. Utopian visions put out one time, or almost no one is writing utopias. Yeah, I mean, yes, there's a bunch of. I don't know. I'm gonna go back to my Marxist negative theology for a second and be like, never state anything positively because you'll be wrong. Like, anyway. So this has been fun, guys. It's been about 2 hours. I have a real life today. It's St. Patty's Day, and I like to do the American thing and pretend I really care about my Irish heritage. And although I'm doing so probably in a kilt because, pan-Celtic confusery and cultural appropriation.
Well, the Irish wore kilts. They just didn't wear tartans.
Right. The Irish tartan is an invention of the 90s. There are several legitimate Irish tartans, but they all were invented in the 90s. Except for that one Ulster tartan, which was found probably by some Scottish guy living in Ulster. So
probably.
Yeah.
There were plenty of those.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm going to go. I also have to do my day job still, because one of the fun things about working from home is your day job never ends.
Fun stuff.
Well, it's only true at the end of the semester. We're in the quarter, and I really do have to grade everything by Monday. So normally I pace myself. Yeah. But it's also, I'm going to do that and party like I am an Irish American. Do you know when the first St. Patrick's Day parade was, Erika?
No, when?
1762. And you know where it was at?
I'm guessing not New York.
It was Boston, and the second one was like 60 something, like 65 or whatever. Then that was New York. But like
Boston makes sense.
Yeah. So the Dropkick Murphys really are sort of like a legacy of St. Patrick's Day. That's embarrassing, but also probably true. And I'm now waiting for Sinn Féin to put me on a list.
I'm sure Tom will be happy to facilitate that for you.
Tom has not threatened me as much as I have threatened Tom. And for people who don't know us at the Emancipation Network, Tom and I yell at each other and traumatize everyone around because we're the two oldest people and we've associated with each other for the longest period of time. And I've threatened to shoot him more than once on air. So I have definitely threatened to choke him more than once on air.
I mean, to be quite honest, I'm not sure he doesn't deserve it.
But really, it's all good. It's all good and fun. Because comrades should threaten each other regularly. Just not actually purge each other most of the time. What would you do if any of your high school students discovered what you do? They do all the time, actually. Like they do. I'm one of the only stupid Marxists who uses my real name. You know what? Even in a very conservative place like Utah, it remarkably doesn't matter. No one really cares what their teacher thinks. They're actually more surprised. They're actually more surprised that I'm not a conservative or a liberal. Most of them think I'm a conservative, actually, because I don't talk like they talk about how I don't. My smart kids will talk about how I'm not constantly trying to we'll explain to them that I just, if I want to teach about anti-racist stuff, I just actually teach the history instead of talk about check your privilege or something. As a side note, I probably shouldn't say much about this. I was a little shocked when there was a statement from the Utah Educational Association, which is Republican, which claimed that January 6th was the first attack on the White House since the War of 1812, which is not true. Or not the White House, the
Capitol.
The Capitol, which is not true. There was a Puerto Rican. A Puerto Rican nationalist group that shot into the main chamber. In the 50s. You know what is funny though? I have managed never to get a key wiki. I actually feel like maybe I'm not good enough.
I you know what? I'm a little surprised that not only am I not on KeyWiki, but all of a sudden the name of the site, what's the hell is the Kiwi Farms?
Yeah,
doesn't seem to know who I am. I've gotten one mention in their but they don't have a page on me, or at least they didn't last time I checked, which kind of surprises me.
Reactionaries, why don't you hate us? Right. I mean, for me, it's the fact that my way of avoiding a KeyWiki, because I have liberal friends who have KeyWikis on them because they joined the DSA for a hot minute, and that will just automatically because that's what that New Zealand guy who runs that thinks is the most dangerous threat to America is the DSA, and I'm like, if only,
right?
If it really was, I'd actually be impressed. But yeah, I don't know. KeyWiki. Let's see. Kiwi Farms. How do I look at who? This is too hard. But yeah, there's no KeyWiki on us here at Emancipation Network. Because we don't. I think actually to get on KeyWiki, you do have to actually do something with Democrats formally.
That makes sense.
Right. Yeah. So otherwise, if you've never worked with a Democrat, they can't call you the crypto, the crypto secret part of the government and the Democrats, because you're just, I guess we're too crazy for that. But anyway, yeah. But to tell you, yeah, my students find it all the time. I haven't met, I don't, I actually, people like, do you teach Marxism to your students? No, I absolutely do not. In Utah, it's illegal. And also, if one of my teachers tried to make me a Marxist, I would have probably rebelled and become even more reactionary than I did become. Because like anything your cool teacher tries to make you do once you grow up will be instantly uncool and suspect. So I don't try to indoctrinate people as a general rule. Not even here on channel. I'm not trying to push a line. You'll see me talk to all kinds of people. I talk to people who I think are smart and that I don't want to yell at, except for Tom, who I do, and Doug Lane, and never mind. That's not a true statement. I talk to people who I think are smart most of the time. I actually particularly like the Marx reading I got in college. Yeah, me either, actually. The Marx I got in college made me feel like Marx was a utopian in a way that was like, what did they have me read about from Marx in college? It was the Manifesto, and that was it.
I think that's pretty much what I read in college when we talked about Marx also. He doesn't really get talked about much.
Yeah, I mean, they threw around all these Marxist theories, but it seemed that I was like, I don't see how this has anything to do with that manifesto I read. Yeah. Varn's starting to let on too much. Yeah, I am actually. What I was gonna say is like, yeah, it's just funny. 1844 manuscripts in late modern political theory. I got taught in history, and I took a course on the crisis of European reason. That's a fun course. It's the crisis of Europeanism. It was a cross-listed course between history, philosophy, and literature, and we did read the Brumaire in that, but I read it as a literary text. So,
I feel like I might have gotten the Brumaire in one of my college history courses when I was at Laney, but
what's funny is I was asked to teach Althusser in a introductory critical an introductory theory of literature class, but we weren't asked to teach Marxist literary criticism other than that and Jameson. So none of the students had any idea what these people were even referring to. Like, it's like, so you teach like these late develop, Marxist and post-Marxist, but without the context of Marx at all. So no one even knows like what the relationship is.
Yep.
I hear that Marx gets taught a lot more in history programs, but I'm not a historian. I am. And when
I haven't taken. I mean, I never finished my undergrad history program. Marx did get talked about a little bit by one of my instructors in my Western Civ class at Laney like 20 years ago.
Yeah, by the way, people, we're old. We're not hip Zennial Marxist.
No.
Not Zennial with a Z, not Zennial with an X. Like we actually are.
And then, yeah, I mean, I haven't taken another course that really. Well, actually, that's not true. In my so when I was studying history in Indiana, that I don't know if this is still the case, but there was essentially an introduction to historiography course that you had to take.
You can't get out of historiography without talking about Marxist historiography. It's actually like one of the areas where Marxism's still like okay to teach in bourgeois circles.
Right. One of the books that we got assigned was David Harvey's The Condition of Postmodernity.
Boo. I mean,
I thought it was. I mean,
no, I think Harvey's a good gateway drug as long as you remember he's a geographer.
Right. And his grasp of Marxist value theory is
non-existent.
Yeah.
Like he's the only person I know who tried to explain volumes of Capital without any recourse to value theory. Which that's hard. That's
What?
hard. Have you
How
read
do you
his
even
three?
do that?
Have you read his three, like his introductions about to
I've
capitalism?
looked. I know I haven't. I've
You would be mad.
seen some of his courses, and I don't remember why I stopped watching.
I remember him going into value theory and then saying this is just not true, so we're going to move on. Like,
yes,
like,
that's probably why I. I remember that. Yeah, that's probably why I just stopped watching, because I'm like, okay, well, if you're not going to talk about value theory, then why am I even watching this?
Like, then like the whole premise of the notion of exploitation you just explained doesn't make any sense without it. Like,
yeah,
but yeah. Yeah, I don't get why he loves the section on the working day yet still rejects LTV. I think it's because like he secretly probably has some Romer or some of the right wing of analytical Marxism like in the background, or maybe he's a crypto Keynesian who likes to. There was this time period in the '90s where you make Keynesianism edgy by like dressing up in Marx costumes.
So, should you read Capital along with Harvey's Companion?
So if you're gonna take a secondary literature on Capital, which I'm not against, you need to read opposing secondary literature.
Yes.
So that you can make your own decisions. So if you're gonna read Harvey's Companion, also read Heinrich's, also read Slyman's, also read Ben Fine.
Yes.
And maybe even Jameson's and Althusser, just so you get some bong rip in there. Sorry. Like
Althusser is some serious bong rip.
But I will tell people read Capital on its own first. And I will say, however, that like contextual notes really do help, but they're going to be biased. Like the edition I have has the Ernest Mandel contextual notes. I'm waiting for the edition that's going to have all the Mega 2 people doing contextual notes.
That should be interesting.
But the Ernst Mandel contextual notes are not bad. Just know he's a weirdo Mandelite trot. I mean, like literally his sect is named after him. So like,
right.
Like he has particular interpretations. Harvey, Cleaver are good. There's the Heinrich. The Heinrich and Ben Fine are good too. But I say good, I don't agree with them. I just think they go over interesting stuff. I mean, Heinrich has a tendency to, be a really good Marx philologist and then like come up with a new interpretation of Marx that's literally based on a letter that was on the back of a postage stamp or something. Like it's
Esri and I were just talking about that the other day. Where she was asking me about God, what the hell?
Hold on, you can think and interact with the chat for a second.
Oh God, what were we talking about? Something about Heinrich. Help me out here, Esri. What were we talking about? Anyway, we were talking about something about Heinrich's interpretation of Marx and some aspect of oh, I remember what it was now. The tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Yes. Okay. Right. Oh, I'd say I'm probably not as good a Marxologist as Derek is. Definitely. whatever Derek recommends, I would go with. All right, Derek's AFK. I'm going to go AFK myself real quick and grab some water. If Derek gets back before I do, let him know what's going on. Well, I mean, you know, if you're going to read one secondary work of secondary literature, you kind of got to read them all. Ah, he's back.
A cardinal sin before the days of live streaming was never ever have blank air, and yet we totally do it all the time in live streams. However, I do need to let you guys go. I've enjoyed it. I agree with Nikos. Not leave reading Capital isn't great for reading Capital. No, it is not great for reading Capital. Even if you're an Althusserian, that's the worst place to start. Heinrich is good for philology. Harvey is good to know how not to read Capital, and yeah.
Yeah, so the Heinrich thing Esme and I were talking about was Heinrich's thesis that Marx actually ended up rejecting the falling rate of profit.
Yeah.
Based on like a scribble in the manuscript and like
yeah, that's the one thing that made me want like the Kleiman paranoid rant about Heinrich that I thought was ridiculous, but I was like, well, that does seem a little bit like you're being bong rip. No, I don't think you're out to destroy. Like, it's funny because Kleiman's always like, everyone's out to destroy Marxism. I'm like, what I think is actually going on is everyone has an academic career and you need to say something novel, and the best way to say something novel is to find something on the back of a napkin that someone wrote once.
Yes.
Like. But yeah. And with that, I'd like to thank you guys for coming out. I'd like to thank Erika. Erika will be semi-regular on the Varn blog, although I have the next 3 weeks booked up. Coming next week is Nico V. Actually will be on to talk, debate, discuss stuff. And the week after that, Andy from Antifada will be there to talk to me about, who knows, maybe aliens. I don't know. I got
I'm not saying it was aliens.
Yeah,
it was aliens.
I'm not saying it was aliens, but the revolution involves aliens and nuclear dolphins.
Peak Posadism.
So but we will we'll see how that goes, and then there'll be a mixture of regulars and scholars coming out through. I'm also going to try to do a personal update once a week. This week it's just rough for me because the end of the semester, and I've had to record a lot of stuff in the last week. I have a book coming out soon, a poetry book, so don't get all excited. And so I've been doing press for that. And I'd like to thank you. Thanks so long, and thanks for all the birthday events. Oh my god. Talk about capitalism and Warhammer. I know who this person is now. That's a person. That's probably one of my Zero Books comrades who was like, the Chaos Gods didn't end the Warhammer universe, capitalism did. And like, while that's true, I also think capitalism is the Chaos Gods. Slanesh is probably the falling rate of value, and corn is imperialism.
Nurgle.
Nurgle's the pandemic, man. Like,
okay.
Anyway, and with that, we're out. Oh, no. India's in denial. India's from Turkey. All right, well, that's not Gene. But who also talked to me about Warhammer and capitalism last week, and who happens to also be Kurdish. So there's a lot of Kurds in the world, unless Edragon has his way. We're Anarchy Bay, baby's first dialectic of enlightenment. That's true. It's the rational core of God Emperor. Oh, okay. St. Patty's Day is too fun. I haven't even had my beer yet.
All right.
Bye, guys.
Later.